Well, thank you so much, Tripti, for that kind introduction. I've been in this region for more than 30 years now, and basically I'm an agricultural scientist, a very humble agricultural scientist who have trumped through hundreds of rice fields. But what I wanted to share in the next few minutes really are 4 points, which I'll go through each one in sequence. The first really is that in the context of this kind of workshop and the RAFT network, it's very important to situate the discourse on losses and waste in the context of food systems. And I'm always reminded of the famous quote that we attribute to Sonny Verghese, the CEO of Olam, when in 2020 he basically said, today the global food and agriculture system is clearly broken. And the way we produce food is not sustainable. And it's broken because of too many inefficiencies in the system, some of which have been alluded to, and also not being able to meet both needs of sustainability and the food demand by the poor. Now, I was just in Manila last week attending the Asian Development Bank's food system transformation. And it's very obvious, the tide of opinion is really shifting towards the fact that we need to do something to reduce inefficiencies, amongst which are losses. So that's my first kind of intervention I want to make. Second intervention, I think, is that, we're a community, quite a mixed community here. And I think we need to be very clear about the scope and meaning of terms. I was involved in the 80s and 90s when I was still a overworked, underpaid assistant professor in Minnesota. FAO had a global program on crop loss assessment, which I was party to actually. And that went on for more than 10 years. So that's interesting. So we're actually now revisiting many of these. And that program was mainly pre-harvest losses. So in terms of the discourse we're holding right now, I think it's important to separate clearly pre-harvest versus post-harvest losses. There's been a lot of work done on pre-harvest losses, mainly due to biotic and abiotic causes, pests, diseases, environmental climate, and so on. And surprisingly, the consensus figure is that there's also about 30% loss from pre-harvest, okay? Which accounts for a lot of yield gaps. Rice is a classic example. Yield gaps in rice range from 30 to 50%, which is very high. And many of these are considered pre-harvest losses. Then what I think this particular workshop is about, post-harvest losses. Again, FAO has actually, attributed post-harvest losses due to mainly inappropriate post-harvest management practices, inefficient technologies, and also the lack of understanding of the factors that affect, for example, quality itself. And I'll come to that shortly. Now, UNEP is also very clear. Okay, they kind of distinguish food waste as the decrease in the quantity or quality of food resulting from decisions and actions by retailers, food services, and consumers. So food is wasted mainly, according to UNEP. UNEP is the UN Environmental Program, by the way, mainly in households, in the food service sector, and in retail. Now, I think for the purposes of discussion, it's actually quite important to also separate quantity from quality loss. I think that the 30% figure, I think that Tripti quoted, I believe is mainly quantity loss rather than quality. So in Singapore, for example, we have very high quality losses because of our aspirations to have perfect vegetables and perfect fruit, yeah? Now, the FAO data shows very clearly that in developing countries, there's higher loss and less waste. Whereas in developed economies, there's lower loss but higher waste. I guess we can consider Singapore in the second category. I want now to refer you to a very good chapter in the book which I edited and was released in 2024. And the title of the book was Food Security Issues in Asia. And there's a chapter in there by FAO, by Rosa Roll, basically on reducing food loss and waste in food systems. I really would like to refer you to that particular chapter because it runs through a very comprehensive understanding of what FAO has been doing internationally and also nationally. Now, the third point I want to really make in a few minutes is that, it's not just enough to consider food loss and waste in the context of food system supply of food, availability of food, yeah? I think in today's context, climate change, the contribution of the last carbon mile is actually very important. And we know that because of food loss and waste, the amount of, carbon equivalent, CO2 equivalents is actually very high because of that. So I think we need to pay some attention to that. And if you look at Asia, Asia as a region, we produce about half of the world's carbon dioxide emissions, right? Especially the 4 countries, China, Japan, Indonesia, India. Very high pre and post production CO2 emissions per capita. Okay? So I think, again, it depends on how you want to scope this particular network, whether you in fact want to include the carbon miles in there. Personally, I think you should, because climate change is such a big issue now in ASEAN. And I say that from experience working with the ASEAN ministers and so on. Now, I also want to share that in 2013, 2014, in fact, FAO, in fact, launched a program called the Regional Safe Food Asia Pacific Campaign. Okay? And the main aim was to reduce food losses along supply chains. Also fight the growing problem of food waste. So this was recognized as long ago as 2014. I'll be very happy to share some of those references, if anybody's interested. Yeah. So in that particular kind of campaign, they also stated that the core requirements to tackle food loss reduction in the Asian region, number one is really to build an evidence base. They build evidence base to allow us to make, I would say, evidence-informed decisions on quality, safety, and quantity. Second is the evidence base on actually how to reduce losses in MSMEs, the micro, small, medium enterprise, and so on. And the third, of course, is on how to improve efficiency across supply chains in the region. This is very relevant to our discussion. I'm reminded, and I actually did my PhD on crop loss assessment, by the way, years ago. I'm very reminded of a quote by a very famous American scientist called George Lyman in the early 20th century, where he actually said, if you don't know how much you're losing, how do you know if your remedial interventions are working? It's still a very relevant question today, But having said that, I think we need to move beyond past aspirations, even today's aspirations. It's not just to identify and quantify loss and also come up with solutions. It's also this whole context of how do you make valuable products out of loss. I think that's a new dimension in this particular time, So we come to the whole topic of waste valorization, which is also attracting a lot of attention right now in the ASEAN region. So not just identify, quantify loss and waste, but find ways, reduces, and additionally on how to create value from waste to contribute to the food system. And we have a lot of encouraging initiatives now by startups and so on in the ASEAN region. Of course, the most notable, of course, are the black soldier fly, a larvae that we all see, hear about really. So just to close off then, so preventing and reducing food waste is just one step. It's a very important first step, but in the context of waste valorization, that's where rescuing surplus food, the swift consumption, creating value from waste, and so on, those definitely should become core priorities in this. And let me just finish off by saying that this last year, I've been very heavily involved in writing the ASEAN 5-year plan, Food, Agriculture, Forestry Sectoral Plan, 2026-2030, amongst which actually is a big component, in fact, on decarbonization, waste itself, and also finding ways for regenerative agriculture. So one of the first thrust is regen agriculture. And you and I all know that regen agriculture depends so much too on trying to reduce waste. Yeah. So with that, Tripti, I think I've used up my time. I don't want to take away too much time from the discussion. So it's a real pleasure to be here. And my apologies, I have to run away for another call later on. Yeah. So thank you very much indeed, Tripti, and all the best for the panel. Thank you.